Okay, welcome everyone to this panel discussion in which we discuss how the state of the world can best be improved. Today at the end of the year 2023, my name is Tallberg, I'm the founder and chairperson of the Global Visions Association. With me I have Risto Marjomaa, who is a university lecturer at the University of Helsinki at the Faculty of Arts in the Department of Philosophy, History and Art Studies. And we are also joined by Antti Kauppinen, who is professor of ethics and political philosophy at the University of Helsinki at the Faculty of Social Sciences. So we thought that we would base this discussion on the lecture that Risto just gave us. And maybe I could start off by asking Antti, what are your first reactions on the talk that Risto just gave us? And then we can also focus on how things can be improved today in the world out of this discussion. So Antti, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. And perhaps it's unsurprising that as an ethicist, I was struck by several references that you made to kind of the rhetorical use of morality and human rights in world politics. And I think it's certainly true that this talk of what's right and what's wrong has this sort of rhetorical function. And it has perhaps been overused by the Western countries in particular, so that it has suffered a kind of inflation. If you're all the time pointing out problems with human rights here or there, people stop taking you seriously. They become cynical, especially when that sort of language is used selectively. When say Western countries use it only when it happens to align with their own interests or the interests of their allies. One obvious example of that today is the kind of condemnation of Russians killing civilians in Ukraine versus the reactions to Israel killing civilians in Gaza. It's not universal. As you observed, there are some European countries who have been quite critical of Israel's conduct in the war, but the United States and many European countries, Germany above all, have had a very different stance towards what looks to an outsider very similar state actions. So that's one thing. As a moral philosopher, though, I would want to emphasize that sort of rhetorical use is just one way to think about this language of right and wrong. And indeed, it was interesting to me that you also used this language in a kind of committed fashion to express your own viewpoint or stance on issues like condemning the Russian attack on Ukraine, which I'm sure it's hard to find someone who disagrees in Finland or in our audience, in our most likely audience online. But I think it's a kind of we even though this sort of language of ethics is sometimes abused and overused, we shouldn't become too cynical and give up on the right and wrong and good and bad altogether. Otherwise, there's not much left for us to discuss in events like this. And it's just not true of human beings that we are somehow fundamentally pursuers of our own self-interest and just don't care about whether our actions are right or wrong. I think that almost everybody does care about that as well and wants to act in ways that they can justify to other people. That they can not just force other people to obey them or tolerate them, but to grant that they are doing the right thing. And that's something that I was thinking about the interesting sort of challenge that the Taliban might pose to the West, as you said. So the situation was this, that the Taliban representative says, like, who are you to tell us what to do with respect to women, for example? And I think that maybe the best way to respond to that from a kind of committed ethical perspective is to say, well, who are you to tell those women not to go to school or not to go to work or to wear a certain kind of dress and not some other kind of dress? To claim for yourself a position of legitimate authority, I think involves presenting that kind of asserting or claiming some sort of moral justification for the use that you are making of your power. Of course, the Taliban might say, well, who am I to tell those women what to do? Well, I am stronger. I have the weapons. I can. That's why I have the authority to tell them not to go to work or not to go to school. But that is to assert this old idea of might is right that we know from ancient Greek philosophy already. And if that's the line that the Taliban take, then we in the West, at least for the time being, can also take that line and say, well, that gives us the authority to tell you what to do because we are stronger than you. And we can, if we want to, we can compel you to do that. On the other hand, if the Taliban enters into the game of ethics, if they try to give us reasons for why women shouldn't go to work, to take that example, then we can enter into a dialogue about that. Well, is it really the case that it has such and such bad consequences if women go to work? There are Muslim countries where women go to work, where women are not forced to wear certain kinds of clothing, and people seem to be doing just fine in those places, and so on. So we can engage in a dialogue with them. So that's kind of one way to enter into a real kind of ethical relationship, even with the Taliban. And I think that fundamentally anyone who claims kind of political authority has to have something to say for themselves. And my own view of human rights is actually that they are the sort of preconditions of legitimate political authority. That any institution, any group of people who claim this status in a society where they can set laws and policies and use the monopoly of legitimate power to enforce them, by making that claim to have the authority to control the lives of other people by force if necessary, I think they have to fulfill certain conditions to have that kind of authority. They have to use that authority in a way that, at least on the whole, somehow benefits and respects those people over whom it is exercised. And that, to me, generates pressure towards some sort of democratic system, some sort of system where the people over whom power is exercised have a say over how that power is exercised. In the absence of that, I think there is no justification for the state. That's a kind of precondition of that. But perhaps this is to go too deep into philosophical theory. But I guess it's not necessarily a bad thing, and I guess it kind of shows how once we start to think about these sort of challenges that are posed by this kind of situation where we have rhetorical uses of morality, where we have the challenge of relativism, a challenge of skepticism and nihilism. In order to respond to them, we end up doing kind of philosophical ethics, even if we're not professional philosophers or something like that. I think those questions and those arguments emerge pretty naturally in anybody's conversation. So that was kind of the first thing that struck me about this presentation. More briefly, I want to mention another thing that caught my attention as a philosopher, and that's how many of these deep problems that we're faced with today are what are called collective action problems. So they are these sort of situations in which there is a course of action that would be best for everyone if everyone took it. But as long as other people are taking that type of action, those who don't take that gain some benefit for themselves. So if it's either everybody goes with it, or somebody can exploit those who go along with that, and that's something that emerges all the time in these things. Obviously, the arms race is a great example of that. The world would be a much better place, really, for everybody if nobody had any weapons. Like that would be a utopian fantasy. But as long as there's even one party, one country, one person who has weapons, it doesn't help really if everybody else gives up. Then that person or that country will become the dominant power, will be able to set the rules for everyone. So that's a deep sort of collective action problem. Like how do we get to this sort of state when there's always this temptation to exploit and free ride and so on. And the same thing comes up in these kind of climate issues in many respects, and there it's kind of intertwined with the capitalist economic system that is obviously based on competition, where as we all know, you have to keep running, because if you stop, then others will overtake you, and you end up at the bottom where it's not very nice to be. And that means, for example, that if one country or one group, even one individual, if they begin to use the Earth's resources in a sustainable fashion, they will easily become losers, because others, as long as others keep running, as long as the others keep exploiting those resources. In the case of nation states, there is a kind of solution to these collective action problems, as was already pointed out by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, and that is to establish a sovereign who can impose the solution on everybody, who can prevent anyone from free riding or exploiting the situation. That's why you have countries where private individuals can't own firearms, for example. They can be punished by the state for that, and because the state is there to ensure that nobody or it's costly or difficult to exploit the relative weakness of others. That incentive isn't there, and and you get into this situation where everybody can, it's a safe society, like Japan, for example. There are very few weapons in private hands, and it's a very safe country. But on the global level, there isn't this kind of authority. There's no kind of body that's above the fray who could enforce either arms control or responsible use of resources or whatever. And that really is a kind of deep problem to which it's very difficult to think of a solution. The solution that springs to most people's minds, it seems to me, is that we repeat the process that we've done at the national level, the establishment of a state, and establish some sort of world government or world state. I think Heikki Patomäki has written about these issues. Who Heikki was meant to be here as well today. It's a pity that he isn't. He can't tell us what his solution to this problem is in detail. In particular, of course, the problem is, even if it were to work in principle, how to get there from here where we are now is a whole different matter. Anyway, those were kind of initial thoughts on the basis of that very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts, Risto, on these comments?
Well, to the last one, there is, of course, this obvious problem that who then controls the sovereign.
Yes.
And this is something which has never been rather got over from the time of Plato.
Yes.
The same problem. You are just moving the level of control higher and higher until there is nobody to control the sovereign itself anymore when it becomes a dictatorship.
Yes, and I guess that's where the solution that is most strongly associated with Montesquieu is the idea that you have the separation of powers, you have these checks and balances so that power isn't concentrated in one hand, in one individual or even one kind of institution, but it's dispersed so that different aspects of the use of power are controlled by different authorities, and that is what has mostly kept the democratic states democratic when it has happened. Of course, we have many examples where it has failed, like the obvious ones from Germany in the 1930s and so on.
And if you would have that kind of world government, then everybody would be a minority in that government. So who's the one controlling the Montesquieu system? Which people, where? Those with the money, those with the certain linguistic talents. It will be practically very impractical in real terms.
Yes, I guess we see it to some extent in the EU
Yes.
already, these challenges. And I think there are kind of genuine questions about the legitimacy of the EU, because it is the power that the EU wields is kind of mediated by so many instances in between, that individual Europeans or the citizens of the EU have very little say about what the EU's decisions are.
Then what comes to the rhetorical form of morality, the problem is that rhetoric becomes hypocrisy. And that's the main problem of European Union. We are not actually doing it. Our closest allies are countries like Egypt, which is a very bloody dictatorship, Israel, which is an apartheid state, Saudi Arabia, where women are partially treated even worse than in Afghanistan. And these are close allies. And then we say that countries like Afghanistan should be banned because of moral reasons. So the hypocrisy is the problem. It's there for everybody on the outside to see. that it's only rhetoric when you are not doing what you are saying. So the problem to me is not doing moral things. If European Union would be able to really portray this moral worldview, then it might perhaps work, but it's not doing so. It has never been doing so. You can have no correlation between the way countries are governed from moral point of view and their relation to European Union. Not at all. We are not close to democracies and away from dictatorships. We are choosing our companions with quite different criteria.
I guess I have a slightly more optimistic view of that, although it's only slightly so. In that, I think that there are kind of bodies within the EU who are trying to who are genuinely applying the same criteria to all countries, and may even be within the EU kind of pushing for action with respect to, say, Egypt. But the reason I'm not particularly optimistic is that whether those initiatives go anywhere turn out to, in practice, to depend on the kind of economic and geopolitical interests of the main powers of the EU, I suppose. So often, as you say, nothing actually happens, and it does. I also agree that it does make us look bad and reduces our, and rightly reduces our credibility because we are not being consistent.
Yeah.
I still think there's something to be said for that, for kind of a dose of idealism in world politics. Because if you have this sort of more cynical attitude of you do whatever you want as long as you let us do whatever we want, and we both benefit from that, as the Chinese are doing, then there any kind of pressure in favor of a kind of more humane policy or policy that, say, takes the interests of future generations into account is going to come from outside the state system, from the NGOs primarily. So I think it's a good thing that at least within the EU and say Finland, people. The fact that it's part of official rhetoric, it does put some pressure on the governments to comply with that. Whereas in a place like China, or if the EU, say, were to adopt the same attitude, there would be no pressure except from the outside. So there's some use for that, but it certainly doesn't seem to do enough. I mean, ultimately, of course, we can take responsibility for that as citizens, because the EU Parliament is elected, and other institutions have representatives who are nominated by governments who are in turn elected. If all Europeans, ordinary European citizens, or a majority of them were to say, we will only vote for people who will actually promote human rights and sustainable development outside of Europe, regardless of our economic interests, then I think it would result in real change in policy. But as a matter of fact, that's not how we vote. No. In fact, in our local and our national elections, did you see these themes come up very much?
No.
I didn't. I mean, what we talk about, the basis on which we vote is much more local, much more short-sighted. There might be. I think there's a kind of a wing, kind of idealist wing in the Green Party, where people are, I think, genuinely concerned about future generations in particular. Like not maybe so much human rights and geopolitics and that. But there are people who genuinely think that we have to change, even make the kind of social changes that lower our material quality of life in the short term, in the interest of the long future. But those people talk about it, but it really doesn't. When it's up against whether taxes should go up or down, it doesn't resonate with that many people.
Yes, I think the problem is that the Chinese way of thinking certainly isn't moral in that way. Well, it is a moral because you have a morality that binds both you and the other, but it's not very high morality. But it's more honest. The dishonesty is the problem with this European point of view. And it's actually, from the point of view of other parts of the world, it's even dragging down those NGOs and political parties and pressure groups you are mentioning, because from the outside it seems that you are just talking, but your governments are doing different things. So it even lessens their credibility.
Yeah, I do confess that I'm a bit concerned about this kind of inflation of this kind of language when it's used, when it's overused, then and when the actions don't match the words, it really threatens to deprive us of seriously thinking and talking about very important issues. Because if people start hearing, oh, that's just more of this sort of babble, this is some sort of smokescreen, this not to be taken seriously, then I mean, what else can we do? Like, we have to maybe innovate, come up with new sort of terminology instead of. I think human rights in particular is the kind of thing that has been used a lot, even within Finnish politics. Like, lots of issues are presented as kind of human rights questions that I think we could discuss in less dramatic terms.
Yes.
I'm quite skeptical of whether Finland is or has been violating human rights of, maybe some asylum seekers that in some cases probably, but that's pretty much all. I think if we think back on the origins of the language of human rights, the kind of treatment of individuals that states were engaged in, it really cheapens the terminology to use it for various maybe injustices that are present in our society, but they're not everything is a human rights violation. Everything that's bad in some way.
Do human rights still give us a tool when trying to solve the problems of the modern world, here and abroad?
I think there's certainly contexts in which they are useful, and talking about human rights is useful, and so like I said at the beginning, I like to limit the use of this language of human rights to issues that really concern the foundations of the legitimacy of the state. So if you're torturing people or arbitrarily arresting people or arresting, disenfranchising people because of the ethnic group membership and so on, those are the kind of things that undermine any moral authority to use political power, and they amount to human rights violations. So we can certainly say that that's what appears to be happening in parts of China, for example. But but we should be very, very careful, I think, when we talk about that. And actually, maybe just building on what you were saying earlier, maybe we should only use that language when we really are willing to take action. So if we say that China is violating human rights, the next sentence should be, therefore, we're not going to engage in trade with China anymore. That would be taking it seriously, because you shouldn't be doing that. You know, if there is a state that is so bad that it's engaged in kind of large-scale human rights violations, a proper response to that, it has to be something that hurts, and often it hurts both sides when you are in a kind of mutually beneficial trade relationship, as we are with China. So yeah, if we did that, I think it would be a useful tool.
What are your thoughts, Risto, on this?
Well, one of the problems with Human Rights Declaration is that it's from 1940s and written by a group of Western judicial specialists. Human rights as a declaration and what people think as morality are two different things. And there are actually other human rights declarations, especially the Cairo Declaration from 1990, which was made by the Muslim countries, and in which the ideas of human rights are portrayed through Islam. And again, if there would be human rights which are recognized by all, which are somehow natural of us in species, then yes, everybody wants to be good. Nobody wants to be bad. We are social beings. We want to think that our deeds are good. Even Adolf Hitler was certain that he was making good to the mankind. We are very good in deceiving ourselves. But here I think there is common ground in good and bad, in morality. But human rights, there is a problem that they are not really for all. For example, the Taliban are not applying our ideas of human rights. Then discussing human rights with them doesn't really work, because they are saying that, no, this is not for us. But if we would be talking of morality, of good and bad, then we might perhaps find more common ground with them. We are kind of, like you were saying, we are kind of overdoing human rights. They have their own place, mainly in judiciary. But there should be much larger, wider contact between us in moral goodness, not in just human rights.
Yeah. What then about democracy as a tool in making the world a better place? Is it a worthwhile tool in the global south, for instance?
I think that it's interesting that you use the word tool in this context. Is there, in the kind of philosophical debate on democracy, there's kind of two basic approaches to its justification, or the question of why should states be democracies? So one is instrumental justification, and the other one is kind of intrinsic value justification. The instrumental justification is, of course, that, well, in some way, things go better when political decisions are made in some sort of democratic fashion, usually understood in terms of indirect democracy, where you elect some representatives and then they make the choices, as is the case for us. But I think there are some quite difficult challenges for the instrumental justification of democracy. There has been some recent literature in philosophy, like Jason Brennan, for example, has this book called Against Democracy, where he argues that with the special, focusing on the special case of the United States, that basically that people are simply too ignorant of political matters to make good decisions when it comes to voting in particular. And so there's lots of polling data that shows that people basically don't know what positions the candidates hold. They don't know what the Constitution says, what the actual laws are. They're very deeply, many people, like most people, are deeply ignorant. So instead of making their political decisions on the basis of facts, they make them on basis of some sort of group identification. That they're kind of picking a team, or usually often they inherit it from their parents or from their friends or whatsoever. And then insofar as they're interested in politics, then so basically there's two classes of people. There's people who are not interested in politics and they don't know anything about it, and there's people who are interested in it, but they are these hyper partisans who see everything through the glasses of their own side, so that whatever people on the other side say is automatically wrong and idiotic and evil and whatever. We've seen this sort of polarization increase in a lot of countries in recent years. So the critics of the instrumental justification of democracy say that this begins in philosophy, of course, begins with Plato. That Plato says, if you're on a ship, you don't let the crew vote on what to do with where to go if there's a storm, or pull up the sails or turn left or turn right. No, you let the captain decide. The person who knows best should make the decisions. So why shouldn't we do that in the case of a state, when there's even more important issues at stake than in the case of sailing? Now, of course, what is to be said in favor of democracy is what Churchill said back in the day, that it's the worst form of government apart from every other one that has been tried so far. So that's, I think that's the kind of best defense. But I don't know if it's the best, but it's certainly a kind of persuasive sort of instrumental defense of democracy. That even though it's deeply flawed, like even if it is deeply flawed as people allege, it looks like the alternatives are even worse. And that's what's being challenged now by the Chinese model, I suppose, yes, in particular, because they're saying, well, this sort of authoritarian capitalism can produce results for individual people, at least in terms of their material quality of life, that are just as good as in a democratic state. So then, really, I think that insofar as we want to promote democracy, not just in our own societies, but also in places that are not democratic at the moment, even places like China, then we have to look to the sort of intrinsic value of democracy, and there's been a lot of interesting work on that recently as well. I mean, I think it's, to me, the most persuasive arguments have to do with the demands of what is sometimes called relational equality. So when I've been teaching about issues of equality, and in the last few years, I've always made the distinction between distributive equality and relational equality, which I think hasn't been so well known in the Finnish discussion at least. So distributive equality is basically just a matter of, you know, everybody having more or less the same amount of some good things or some bad things. And a lot of the debates about equality have to do with, say, money or wealth, about how should that be equally distributed or not. But my view is that it can be important, but it's not important in itself. That there's nothing particularly good about the fact that, say, that everybody has the same amount of money, for example. I mean, that could be achieved by burning all the money of the rich people so that everybody's poor. There's nothing really good about that, I think. In itself, it might have some good consequences, and although I don't think that really work. But what's important is that people stand in these relations of equality to each other. That it's not the case that some people are kind of inferior and some people are superior to others. Like that's the kind of more fundamental dimension of equality in my mind, where kind of people can look each other in the eye and they don't have to kind of defer and bow and scrape in front of other people, as they have to do in class societies that have been kind of the norm in state societies, at least for a long time. So I think that the intrinsic value of democracy is linked to this sort of relational equality in various different ways. But in the most simple way, that if it's not the case that you and I have kind of equal say in decisions that affect both of us and that bind us by the force of law and that are enforced by the monopoly of legitimate violence, if you get to dictate those laws and I don't get to say anything about that places us in that sort of position of inferiority and superiority that is intrinsically kind of morally problematic. Now, of course, some might say that this sort of ideal of equality is something that's somehow distinctively Western in nature, and it's certainly true that it is more prevalent in Western societies, but that's a very recent development, because 100 years ago, 150 years ago, most places in Europe, actually there's a contrast there between the United States and Europe in that respect, because it really is part of the founding ideology of the United States that there is this ethos of democratic equality that, like, de Tocqueville, for example, wrote about in the early 19th century already, how people, how he admired how Americans, like, if there's some decision to be made at the local level, like people get together in the church or the Liberty Hall or some venue like that, and they debate it, and everybody can stand up and make their proposal, and then they vote and they decide. And everybody feels entitled to do that. And that certainly wasn't the case in Europe in the 19th century, for example. So it's a recent ideal, even for us, that we should be equal in this sort of way. But then I think there are people like Amartya Sen who have argued that actually these ideals are not that distinctively Western after all, that you find them in many other cultures.
Yes.
And there's always people, the people who de facto hold power in a given society. They might have an interest in kind of suppressing these ideas, and they can be more successful in say, societies where you don't have the printing press or whatever. You can't distribute the ideas as freely. But the ideas are there. I do think that they arise from kind of our everyday experience. Nobody wants to be humiliated. Like everybody, if they got to choose, they want to be at least equal to others, and they want to be respected, and they want to feel respected by other people. And I don't think that there's anything Western about that idea. And so, to me, democracy is fundamentally kind of matter of institutionalizing this idea of equal respect. And that has value that's independent of the consequences that it might have for the material welfare, for example. So that, I think that's the strongest case to be made for democracy now. Yeah, but how to make that case in an African country, for example, that is presently being ruled by some military group of military leaders, and if they are improving the people's material situation with the help of the Chinese, it could well be that, in a way, although it's kind of strange to say, but equal respect may be a kind of luxury that once you have reached a certain level of material conditions, then you get more interested, you're more invested in ensuring that you're being treated with respect. But if you're living in absolute poverty, what you want is food on the table, you want your kids to have some sort of healthcare or something like that. Those things, you're willing to be humiliated a little bit to get those.
Risto, what about your thoughts on all this?
Well, there is two problems with democracy. Our modern democracy is not very democratic, and nobody knows what it is. The idea of democracy comes from ancient Greeks, and they would not call our Finnish system democracy, because for them democracy was popular meeting of free men, and everybody decides. And this actually is very common all around the world. It has been used, perhaps ironically, especially in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. They used to be like that in many societies, that you all got together. In many cases, even the women get together, and then you discuss until you get your decision. The same with the American Indians and many other parts of the world. So it's kind of natural, this kind of meeting. But this is not what we are doing. It's not what we are doing in Finland. I have never made any political decision. I have only voted for somebody to make political decision. So it's so remote from this original idea that makes it problematic. That, as I said, if I would be offered 10,000 euros for not voting, would I miss anything? Would I miss anything if I wouldn't vote anymore? Me personally, as one person. The other problem is with democracy itself. Democracy as such only means that we decide together, but not what. It's a system. It's an amoral system. For example, in Finland, we have a problem with pensions. We have a large amount of pensions, and people are getting more older. Okay, we could democratically decide that everybody over 70 is killed. If majority will vote for that, okay, it's a democratic decision. What we are really saying when we talk about democracy is not only of this system, but a huge moral package which goes with it. Minority rights, right to live, right to equality, at least at some level, and so forth. It's kind of part of the package, but it's not inherent in the idea of making decisions. I would say that, for example, in ancient Athens, people could make decisions to kill someone. That we don't like this man, let's have him killed. And for them, that was quite democratic decision, as it is. It was a decision by the majority. But this kind of democracy won't work. So we have to have sets and balances to keep the society together. And I think that most of the problems comes there because we don't have a common idea what these checks and balances are. For example, in the United States, you have people with so many different ideals of what kind of society they want. A case in point would be abortion. Is abortion a murder or is it healthcare? You can make a claim for both. But certainly you are probably not going to agree the opposite position just for being democratically chosen. If most of the people say abortion is illegal, then would you, if you are against abortion, just, okay, so that's it. And that's part of the problem. It's not a moral system, democracy. It has to have a moral system. And thus, at least so far, I can't figure out any representative democracy in a modern world that would be poor. It seems to be something which we can only afford in a country which is relatively rich and highly educated, of course, but also a country in which you don't have these kind of great inconsistencies in the morality of the population. Whereas, so you could say that the best democracies seem to be rather small, like Finland or the Nordic countries. And the larger country gets, the more problematic its democratic processes are because there are many different societies within it. It's kind of wonder that the actual great democracy of our time is not United States, it's India. India has been a democracy for whole of its independence, although in the 70s they had a grey area, but most of it, well, we had grey area with Kekkonen. That's the unusual case. More than 1 billion people and it's still somehow working, but it's really working somehow. There are about 5 or 6 ongoing revolts, armed revolts going always in India. The parties are on each other's throats, people get killed. So with a larger society, it's very hard to find this common morality around which you could have democracy. If your values are different, then you are not following. And that's the problem of the United States. I really don't know how they are going to get over this crisis they are now, because they are moving so far from each other that whatever happens, one side is not going to accept the democratic rule of the other because it's too far from their own moral values. And this is a problem. So it's not democracy itself, it's what we use of it.
Are there then some possibilities of changing democracy in order for it to be made to work better in the current world? What are your views? Modified or changed or improved or something?
Well, so I was thinking about that. I really like that question about the 10,000 euros and voting. And I guess maybe I would sell my vote for or give it up for 10,000 euros, but I would be much more reluctant to if what I had to give up was writing or speaking publicly on matters of policy. And I think that's really like one. There is this thin sense of democracy where we're just thinking about voting and counting votes and the majority wins. And it is genuinely, it is the kind of simplest, the most basic form of democracy. But I also think that as it has developed in the political context, and maybe it actually, even if you think about a kind of a mini context of say, a group of people trying to decide, are we going to go to the movies or the theater today? Like one this minimalistic democratic procedure would be to, okay, let's vote. But another one is, okay, so what is there to be said in favor of going to the theater? Those who want to go to the theater, make the case for going to the theater, and make the case for going to the movies. Let's talk about whether these considerations that you presented in favor of that is this really the case? Is today the best day to So let's say one of them is more relaxing. Is today the best day to relax now, or should we rather develop our intellectual skills? Whatever is the argument. So I think that it's important to remember that there's this kind of what is often called the kind of deliberative side of democracy. That's important in addition to just voting or aggregation of people's opinions. That you change people's opinions, you change your own opinions, and ideally. I think people rarely change their own opinions, but sometimes it happens, especially when it's something that doesn't directly concern themselves. So if you have this sort of richer conception of democracy, well, then you can ask, well, what are the... So one thing you can ask is, well, what are the conditions of possibility of having a democracy like this? Well, one condition, and for it to continue to exist into the future, because if we're talking about institutions, democratic institutions, we're not just talking about an individual decision. One thing that follows from that is, if we think about it in this sort of institutional, future-oriented fashion, is that there will be some things that the very idea of democracy rules out of contention in democracy. For example, there's killing people who would disagree with you. Because if you do that, then you undermine the possibility of future democratic decision-making. But if we think of democracy in this richer fashion that involves more than voting, also this sort of rational persuasion, well then the idea of democracy entails that you have to have some kind of education for people so that they can... So you can kind of squeeze out of the idea of democracy some of these more substantial moral conditions. That's one style of argument that people in the Kantian tradition have been making in particular. So this was kind of commenting and elaborating on some of the things in the previous comment, but on the question of how to improve our democracy, which I think is definitely lacking in many respects. One thing that I've found quite fascinating is this idea of trying to, like, there's considerable appeal to the sort of direct democratic model that existed in places like Athens, and it's obviously impossible to realize in a large-scale society like ours, not to mention India or something like that. But people have come up with ideas of trying to somehow approximate that. So I used to live in Ireland for 9 years, and what they've been doing is they've had these so-called citizens' assemblies, which are kind of experiments in direct democracy. So very briefly, the idea is that you select randomly 100 citizens, actually 99 citizens, who are representative of different kind of social groups. So it's not like fully random. You don't just pick up names, but you take people from different sort of categories. And then there's some neutral chairperson, and you bring them together over a period of several months, might be even a year, to discuss some particular political issue, to listen to experts talking about the facts, to listen to advocates of different positions on that issue, and then they debate and they vote on some sort of resolution on that. And I think that it has kind of worked surprisingly well, like even on issues like abortion. So I think the current abortion law in Ireland is to some extent based on the Citizens' Assembly deliberations on abortion. I mean, this is a good example because Ireland traditionally has been, very restrictive in terms of abortion as a Catholic country. But even though the majority of people in the Citizens' Assembly were Catholics who debated that, they came up with a much more permissive proposal than the law was at the time. I just checked it out. I think the latest one might have been on drug policy, and that also, after this sort of process of these kind of randomly selected people debating and listening to experts and advocates, they also came up with, not like the fully liberal policy of Portugal, but more liberal than they currently have. They haven't adopted that. But then it's something that's taken to the parliament where it's discussed, and it's potentially at least the basis for legislation. So I think that's a really interesting sort of experiment and a kind of model where you kind of bring some of the benefits of direct democracy into these large-scale societies. And the surprising thing to me has been that people report that they, in the Irish case, that they've had kind of good experience, and and people have changed their minds as a result of this sort of process, which obviously is much more engagement than most of us ever have in politics if we're not involved. Like, we don't meet people, But if you're, if I got a letter from the Finnish Parliament saying you have been randomly selected to discuss the issue of, I don't know, asylum seekers from the Russian border, whatever, I would be thrilled. I would want to discuss, want to hear what the facts actually are, and I think that it's really important that when people engage in sort of face-to-face discussions with those who disagree with them, it's really much harder to kind of demonize the other person. Like, for most of us, at least. I mean, I can't. I mean, it really does almost any position. Like, it's difficult to say you're completely wrong about that when you're face to face with somebody. And it does seem like it actually works, even in a case like abortion, where other people think it's like you said, medical matter, and others think, no, this is a fundamental, it's a life and death issue. It's murder. Even people like that can actually have a discussion if they're doing it face to face. If they're online, I think that has made things worse.
Risto, what are your thoughts on these possibilities?
Well, basically, I quite agree. I have myself always thought that of all political theories, anarchism is closest to logical rationality, that we should be able to do as much as possible the decisions that are meant for us, our own decisions. And that means a very low level of democracy, of something like what were you talking about. Of course, I would allow those who want to go to theater to go to the theater, the others would go to movies. You don't have to go, everybody doesn't have to go to theater. So in this kind of very low level decisions, well, we have Switzerland. It's not always worked very well there, but it is a democratic system. It is a system in which people feel empowered in that system. It's also a very traditional system in which one of the cantons was the last to give voting rights to women in Europe, only in 1970s. That's what you get. But that's what you get if you allow people to decide. The other thing, you were discussing that people should be kind of taught into making decisions. That sounded like Maximilien Robespierre, and it didn't go well with him. Robespierre was very much interested in this idea of alun perin, originally from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that people should not be allowed to decide on their lives until they have been trained to do so. And the question was, by whom and how? I think Rousseau is often very much maligned for this. I think he was being kind of cynical with this question, but this question has been later used, for example, by Vladimir Lenin in his theories, Rousseauism, and also Maximilien Robespierre, who was responsible for the terror regime in France, that we first have to break the people into understanding how to rule themselves, and only then we can allow them to rule themselves. So it has the same problem as this idea of world sovereignty. Who's going to control the people who are supposed to train us to be better democrats? But somewhere on that line, on increasing local level of decision, of empowering people to make decisions, that's probably the only way we can improve democracy, because otherwise it's always somebody else who is actually making the decisions, and we are only asked to either favor or be against these decisions made by others, and it's not really that much democratic.
Maybe we will finally turn back to the global scale and look at possibilities on a global level when you think about everything we have said so far. So what are the possibilities of global governance and making good decisions on a global level?
Yeah, I think probably all the problems that we have mentioned in any context are worst at the global level. In part, so one thing has to do with the sheer scale of things, but above all the variety, the differences between people and their outlooks, their opinions, even their. And we're not just talking about moral opinions, but their factual opinions, even their views about science or how to go about finding the true answers to factual questions. There's so much sort of disagreement and difference at the global level, and in addition, making it worse is the fact that there are conflicting interests among people, and they're much more radically conflicting interests than we have within a nation state like Finland. I mean, it's clear if we think about the situation in Gaza, they really are directly, like, there's just a compromise seems very difficult to achieve between these neighboring countries. And if we talk about sort of global governance, if we wanted to find some way of governing things that could reach some sort of consent of everybody, or every country or something like that, it's really difficult to imagine how we could get to that. So I guess the current system is where we don't have any real governing bodies. Like, governance is really done kind of at the national level. We have institutions like the UN that serve to kind of mediate conflicts that arise. And I mean, it's not by no means worthless at doing that. I think it's good that we have that kind of structure. Maybe ideally we would have something that would have some kind of genuine power to interfere in conflicts, for example. But my imagination isn't sophisticated enough to think how we can get there and how that could actually remain kind of impartial in the way that is required, and it's required for the kind of trust that is necessary for an institution like that to function. I think in this respect, the International Criminal Court is an interesting experiment because I think that it does enjoy some measure of authority, that those investigations are very thoroughly conducted and impartial. So one question is whether something like that could be extended, whether there could be some sort of maybe advisory body or something that could issue opinions on armed conflicts around the world. That would probably have to be composed of not so much of politicians, but probably more like lawyers and maybe even philosophers from different cultures around the world, if they could agree on some kind of fundamental principles for assessing how the international community should respond to different situations. Maybe in due course, some institution like that could offer some moral guidance. I can't kind of get into the level of legal kind of structures at the global level that would actually be binding and that could enforce the decisions. But maybe we could try to develop this sort of more kind of advisory bodies, maybe through the UN, that is probably the most broadly legitimate kind of international institution. I don't know. This is really more political theory and science fiction than and Heikki Patomäki.
Risto, your thoughts?
Well, Mahatma Gandhi once criticized the Western idea of human rights. He died in 1948, so just after the Human Rights Declaration, that where are responsibilities? Why are these only human rights and not human rights and responsibilities? Are we not responsible for each other? Don't we have duties towards each other? And I think he had a good point that we should try to find these general, we are social beings, so we should be able to find common ground rules on what is good and what we want. It's not a cultural question, it's a question of species, of what are the basic rules, who should we be responsible for and how. But in practical terms, okay, the International Criminal Court, 15 years ago, the Ugandan government tried to make, finally, a peace treaty with the Lord's Army, a Christian terrorist group in Uganda, which had killed, well, probably tens of thousands of people and raped a very brutal group. But then the International Criminal Court protested that no, you can't give amnesty to somebody like Joseph Kony. He will have to be brought to justice, which meant that, of course, he didn't sign And the Ugandan government wasn't very happy about this because the war, of course, continued. Thousands of people got killed and raped. Joseph Kony probably died only 2 years ago in coronavirus, unless that also was. It's very hazy ground, but he probably has died now. So justice, how many innocent people's lives is justice for one man worth? I don't think it's probably not a road forward, because it raises this problem that is justice itself so important that we can allow people to suffer, innocent people to suffer for it? Isn't that too high price to pay to get one man to justice? Of course, it's Joseph Kony himself who is responsible for this continuing violence, but it's very understandable that he didn't make peace treaty if he's not going to be given amnesty. Of course he doesn't. He tries to protect himself, and not only himself, the other peoples in his group. He feels responsible for them. So that's a problem in any kind of attempt to create this kind of world government, that they usually threaten people. They don't take responsibility for their own actions. We use human rights to do wrong to people because we think that human rights are more important than people's lives. And so, well, I'm with Mahatma Gandhi in this, that we will need more responsibilities. We will need to think what it really is that we want in common. What is the goodness in this world? And only then start to build from that, and not from this more or less artificial moral ground of good and bad.
Okay, thank you. This was really interesting. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you.